They showed up in black suits, fake tears, and empty hearts, but not a single one of them had visited her in years. I stood there, watching my own family pretend to mourn a woman they only remembered when there was money on the table. This story isn't just about a will, it's about silence, about the kind of quiet neglect that doesn't leave bruises but leaves scars. Welcome to Grandma Stories, where we uncover the truths families try to bury. The story I'm about to tell you, it still makes my hands shake because what she did, what my grandmother did after being forgotten, wasn't loud, wasn't cruel. It was calculated, and it changed everything. Let me take you back to where it started, before the money, before the lawyer, before the list. Back when the neglect felt normal. The pattern of neglect. You want to know when I first realized I wasn't family anymore? It wasn't when they stopped calling. It wasn't when I spent 3 birthdays alone. No, it was the night I made dinner for 5 and packed up leftovers for 1. Mine. I set the table with the good china that night, lit candles, put on the record my husband and I used to dance to. The clock ticked past 6, then 7. By 8, the roast was cold and I was still lying to myself. They must have gotten stuck in traffic, I said out loud to an empty room. I told myself stories for a long time that they were busy, that they'd make it up next week. That missed holidays were just accidents, but they were. You don't forget someone who matters, and I stopped mattering. Birthdays became quieter. Mother's Day was just another Sunday. They stopped asking what I needed and only called when they needed something. Grandma, could you help with tuition? Grandma, my car broke down again. Grandma, just one more time. But no one ever said, Grandma, how are you? One time, I tripped in the kitchen reaching for a mug on the top shelf. I fell hard, cracked my hip, and couldn't move. I laid there all night. The only light was the fridge door, still open from when I dropped the juice. The next morning, the mailman found me. I laughed when he asked why I didn't call my family. What could I say? That I already knew no one would answer? That wasn't the first time I felt invisible, just the one I couldn't ignore. After that, I started writing things down. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. I wrote dates, who visited, who didn't, who remembered my birthday, who only remembered their own rent was due. I didn't plan it at first. But the notebook grew. 2 pages turned into 20, and 20 turned into a quiet archive of abandonment. They thought I was losing my memory. That's the irony. I was the only one remembering everything. You might think I was lonely. That's not wrong, but loneliness doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being forgotten by people who once called you home. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't complain. I just watched and waited. Because when people show you what you mean to them, over and over again, believe them. And when the time came for me to make decisions, I remembered every single thing they forgot. Some days I wondered if they even remembered I was still alive. I'd hear their voices through the phone when they but dialed me, loud and full of laughter, voices I hadn't heard directly in weeks. One time I answered and said, "Hello." And the line went dead. No call back, no apology, just silence. That silence became a companion of mine. It followed me from room to room, louder than any argument, heavier than any goodbye. I started testing them, if I'm being honest. Little things. I'd unplug the fridge and wait to see if anyone noticed when the milk went bad. I let the front yard grow wild with weeds, watched if anyone would say a word. They didn't. The only call I got that month was from my oldest granddaughter asking if I could help co-sign her apartment lease. She didn't even pretend to ask how I'd been. I said yes. Then I added her name to the notebook. It wasn't just the big moments they missed, it was the small ones. I had surgery on my foot, outpatient, nothing serious. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to see if they'd notice the limp. No one did. They were too busy talking over me at Thanksgiving. asking about stock prices and vacation plans. I sat at the end of the table with a heating pad and a slice of pie no one touched but me. Sometimes the neighbors asked how I was holding up. One of them, Janice, left a pie on my porch every Sunday. She wasn't family, but she saw me. Meanwhile, my own blood forgot my favorite color, my allergies, the way I used to hum when I made tea. I became a background hum in their lives, familiar but never really heard. I still sent birthday cards, still remembered their graduation dates. I still prayed for them at night. But somewhere deep down, I started letting go of the idea that love would ever come back in the same shape I gave it. That kind of grief doesn't break you all at once. It wears you down like water on stone. And yet, I didn't hate them. That's the twist, isn't it? I didn't stop loving them. I just stopped believing their version of love was real. So I smiled when they visited once a year. I nodded when they said, "Next time for sure." And when I closed the door behind them, I sat down, opened the notebook, and wrote one more line in ink. Not to remember them, but to remind myself I was still real. Because if they wouldn't carry the story of who I was, I damn well would. The shift in grandma. They thought I got quieter because I was slipping. Losing it, getting old, but I wasn't slipping, I was watching. Listening, measuring silence. Counting the ways a person can disappear while still being alive. It started the day I overheard my grandson on the phone. He'd called me by accident, again, and didn't realize I could hear every word. He was talking to someone about a vacation, and when they asked about me, he laughed. "She's fine," he said, "just old and forgetful. We'll deal with her when the time comes." Deal with me like I was a problem to solve, a suitcase to store, a checkbox to tick off once I was gone. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the family photo on the dresser. The one they all signed for my 70th birthday. Smiling faces, glitter pen messages. And behind every smile, a new version of the truth. I was a placeholder in their lives. A utility, not a woman, not a grandmother, just a name on a future deed. So I made my first appointment with a lawyer. Not one of those TV attorneys with shiny hair and empty eyes. No, I picked a woman named Carla. Small office, serious voice, and the kind of eyes that didn't flinch when I said, "I want to make a will they'll remember." I brought her everything. My notebooks, my banking records, my old letters. She read without judgment. Didn't look at me like I was bitter or broken, just thorough. She said, "You've been documenting abandonment." That word struck me harder than I expected. I hadn't said it out loud, but hearing her say it made it real. This wasn't just sadness. This was a pattern, a truth. We built the will like a story, carefully, deliberately. No drama, just facts. I made video statements. I signed everything with witnesses. I protected the documents with codes and timing locks. I made sure they'd be legal, airtight, irreversible. I didn't want room for interpretation. I wanted a record. And as I did all this, I didn't stop being the same grandmother they thought they knew. I still answered their calls when they came. I still smiled in family photos. I still gave them what they asked for, just so I could watch how they received it. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes when you give someone what they want and see they still feel entitled to more. One evening, my daughter came by after months of silence, said she was checking in, brought me store-bought cookies like it was a peace offering. 5 minutes in, she asked if I'd thought about passing on the house early to avoid taxes. I nodded, thanked her for the cookies, wrote her name down again. Another time, my grandson asked if I had someone I trusted managing my will. I said I'd think about it. Then I watched his smile twitch when I didn't offer details. That night, I recorded another message for the file. But the worst moment? It wasn't betrayal. It was confirmation. The moment I realized no one was coming back for me, not truly. They were circling, waiting for the end, not because they were grieving, but because they were counting. Counting years, dollars, square footage, so I started counting too. Number of missed holidays, 8. Number of times someone asked if I was eating well, 1. Number of I love yous that weren't followed by requests, 0. They thought I was knitting sweaters. I was knitting a net. And the day I sealed the final copy of my will, I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt clean, like I had finally swept the last corner of a house no one cared to visit. I went to bed that night with the window open. Let the cold air in. Let the quiet wrap around me, not as a punishment, but as proof. Silence isn't always empty. Sometimes silence is a weapon. Sometimes it's a monument. Sometimes it's justice, written in cursive, notarized, and waiting in an envelope. The funeral staging. I always wondered how they'd show up when it was my time. Would they cry? Would they feel anything real? Turns out the answer came faster than expected and colder than I imagined. It started with the phone tree. My son called my daughter. She called the others. Within 48 hours, flights were booked, outfits were planned, and the group chat I hadn't been included in for years lit up with logistics. Not grief, logistics. The funeral home told me, posthumously of course, that my family insisted on the nice package. Not because they wanted to honor me, but because they didn't want to look cheap. They chose roses, not because I loved them, but because they photographed well. They came dressed in black, all somber eyes and hushed tones, hugging each other like actors backstage before the curtain rises. I wasn't there in body, obviously, but I knew every gesture, every fake tear, every glance over the shoulder, not for memories, but for the lawyer. I had already written everything, paid for everything. Even picked out the music, instrumental only. No lyrics to pretend to connect to, just sound. I didn't want to give them a script to fake emotion to. Still, I left behind one thing they couldn't control, the truth. And that truth was waiting for them at the end of the service. After the service, they gathered in the reception room. Coffee in styrofoam cups, polite smiles, small talk with strangers they didn't recognize but pretended to. My daughter wore my favorite brooch. She never asked to take it, just assumed it was hers now. My grandson asked the director if the reading of the will would happen today or later this week. He tried to sound casual, but I knew the tone. I'd heard it every time someone thought they were being patient while waiting on something they believed they were owed. Then Carla walked in, the lawyer. She wore navy instead of black, carried a folder tucked tight under her arm. My family stiffened. She wasn't supposed to be here. No one invited her. That was the point. She cleared her throat and said, "Per the wishes of the deceased, I've been instructed to read a statement immediately following the service." They didn't clap, didn't object either, just nodded, already imagining numbers. "Property, bonds, jewelry, the house," she began. "My name is Carla Morales, legal counsel to the late Eleanor Me Hartwell. This reading is per her explicit direction. All decisions outlined herein have been legally notarized and recorded, with no room for amendment or challenge." A few of them glanced at each other, like suddenly realizing they were in a courtroom, not a condolence call. Then came the twist. "To those present, you are not here to receive, you are here to be reminded." My daughter's smile dropped. My son crossed his arms. Carla continued. "Eleanor Me Hartwell has chosen to donate the entirety of her estate to the National Foundation for the protection of elderly survivors of abuse and neglect." A gasps, whispers. A chair scraped loudly as someone stood up, then slowly sat down again. Carla didn't flinch. "Furthermore, Ms. Hartwell has prepared personal messages for each of you. These are not included in the legal will, but are preserved as part of her final statement. They will be sent privately." Silence heavy, brutal. And lastly, she said, flipping one last page, a message to those who considered her invisible. You never saw her, but now the world will see what you left behind. No one said a word, not right away. I wish I could describe what I felt in that moment, but I wasn't there to feel it. I was already gone. I'd already let it go. All that remained was the echo of truth bouncing off faces trained to pretend and now unable to hide. They came expecting gratitude. They left with a mirror. The fallout. If the funeral was the stage, then what came after was the fire. And I wasn't there to put it out. The ride back from the service was quiet for most of them. My son apparently didn't speak the entire way. My daughter was already on her phone, texting someone about next steps. One of the grandkids tried to play peacemaker. It's not about the money, he said, but even he didn't believe that. Later that night, they started calling each other, first with confusion, then denial, then rage. There has to be a mistake. She must have been manipulated. Who the hell is this lawyer anyway? They circled around the truth like vultures, picking at the bones of a woman they never really bothered to feed. They didn't know about the videos yet. I made sure those came a day later. Time delayed, like little emotional bombs. Each one recorded in my voice on camera. No trembling, no theatrics, just clarity. One for each of them, with dates, with receipts, with words they thought I hadn't heard, with memories they forgot I had. And at the end of each one, the same sentence, "You taught me how to leave you behind. I just finally listened." My daughter tried to get Carla on the phone, left 3 voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said. "My mother wasn't in her right mind." But the truth is, she knew I was. That's what scared her. I had been more lucid, more exact than they ever imagined. I hadn't lost my mind, I had reclaimed it. My son, the oldest, tried a different angle. He went online, Googled how to contest a will, called 2 different lawyers, even asked an old golf buddy if he knew any flexible judges, but Carla had locked it down. Everything was sealed, stamped, time-stamped. There was no back door, no technicality, just consequence. And the grandkids, they were split. Some blamed each other. One cried and said, "She always loved you more." Another said, "Maybe if you visited once in a while, she wouldn't have done this." One stormed out. Another posted a vague quote on Instagram. "Sometimes people write you out because you wrote them off first. Too little, too late. Too public, they all thought they were the center of my story, but they were just chapters. And the ending, that was mine to write." Some of them tried to turn the tide, called me brave in their Facebook posts. "Grandma taught us strength," they wrote. "She was a fighter." But where was that love when I was alive? Where was that praise when I sat in silence, waiting for a knock that never came? Janice, the neighbor who brought me pies, she got nothing from the will. No money, no letters. But she left flowers by my door and cried longer than anyone else, because she had given something real while expecting nothing in return. That kind of love doesn't need a receipt. Back inside their homes, my family sat with the weight of what wasn't theirs. Not just the house or the bank account, but the story. They didn't own it anymore. They couldn't twist it. I had spoken, finally, and my words didn't tremble. I heard one of them say, "She must have been so angry." But they missed the point. This wasn't anger, it was honesty. There's a difference. Anger lashes out. Honesty just holds up a mirror and lets people see themselves. And in that mirror, they didn't see a villain. They saw the vacancy they'd created. They saw a woman they called Mom, Grandma, Ellie, but never once truly asked about. Never once tried to know beyond the roles she played for them. I was their background music, their seasonal obligation. A holiday voicemail they forwarded and forgot, but not anymore. Because now, the silence had a shape, and it was cut in legal paper. I didn't want revenge, I wanted reflection. And when you give people the truth unwrapped without apology, they don't know where to put it, so they drop it, or they run from it, or they pretend it was never there. But this time they couldn't pretend, because the echo of what I left behind was louder than anything they ever said to me while I was alive. The message drops. Ngoy K letter 1EC3. Ba NGO letter 1EA1. IGI letter 1ECD. NGS letter 1EAFCL letter 1E1NH. TH letter 1EA5 UDAO. GUN letter 1ED9 ITAM. M letter 1ED7 I lost through N who M letter 1ED9T. N hot shame NH letter 1EB9 N hung T H letter 1EA5 UMAO. The letters were scheduled to arrive 3 days after the funeral. I picked that timing for a reason, just enough time for them to sit in the silence, just enough space for hope to grow, then snap. Each envelope was handwritten. No printed labels, no logos, just ink, just weight. The kind of letter that feels heavier before it's even opened. Some held only a page, others held more, but everyone was soaked in truth. My daughter S arrived first. She opened it in her kitchen, probably while sipping that overpriced tea she never offered me. Inside, 4 pages, every word chosen like a scalpel, not to hurt but to cut clean. I started like this. I loved you more than I loved myself, and I watched you turn that love into convenience. I reminded her of the time she left me at the hospital to go shopping, of the time she gave me expired canned soup and said she didn't have time for groceries, of how she'd roll her eyes when I forgot things, but never asked if I was sleeping or eating or just lonely. You wanted my strength but mocked my weakness, so I stopped showing both. She didn't finish the letter in one sitting. She never could finish anything when it wasn't about her. My son's letter was shorter, 2 pages, no pleasantries. I addressed him the way he hated, as Robert, not Rob. I reminded him of the day he told his friends I was a burden he had to manage. He didn't know I was standing behind the door. He laughed afterward. They all did. You said you'd take care of me when Dad died. But what you meant was you de-delegate me, like a broken appliance you can't toss yet. I included a photo from the last time he took me to lunch. The receipt showed the date, 5 years ago. The photo showed him on his phone. I was looking at the window. To my oldest granddaughter, I wrote with more sorrow than anger. She had a soft heart once. She used to sit with me on the porch and ask about my youth, but something shifted when she moved away. She stopped calling, came back only when her tuition ran out. You knew better, that's what hurts most. You knew how it felt to be ignored, and you chose comfort over kindness. So I forgave her, quietly, but I didn't reward her. Sometimes forgiveness is a closed door, not an open hand. To my youngest grandson, the one who never visited, I didn't send a letter. I sent back every unopened holiday card he mailed with a stamped return address. Marked, "Return to sender." Addressee no longer recognizes the relationship. Not out of cruelty, out of accuracy, but there was one more letter, to Janice. It was handwritten in purple ink, the same color she always wore on Sundays. Inside, a pressed daisy and a check made out to her church fund. She once told me she stayed up nights worrying about the heating bill at their shelter. Now she wouldn't have to. You loved me like family when family forgot how. That kind of love doesn't go unnoticed, it goes eternal. She cried quietly, alone, no Instagram post, no performance, just grace. Each letter landed differently. Some sparked fights, some caused silence. One of them, my daughter's, was torn in half and taped back together by morning. I wasn't there to see their faces, but I didn't need to, because the letters weren't revenge. They were record, memory bound in paper. They were what happens when a woman stops waiting to be understood and starts writing her own obituary. And here's what I know: truth doesn't always heal. Sometimes it just ends the lie. The public shockwave. The story wasn't supposed to go public, but truth has a way of leaking, especially when guilt leaves the door wide open. It started with a reporter, small-time local, digging through probate records. The headline was quiet, almost polite. Elderly woman leaves fortune to abuse survivor network, family left out. But it hit like a hammer. Within 48 hours, bigger outlets picked it up. Then came the blogs, then Twitter, then TikTok. Suddenly, I was Alina Hartwell anymore. I was Justice for Grandma. I was a viral parable. And my family, they were the villains. Every old photo of them smiling next to me became evidence. Every "we loved her deeply" comment was met with screenshots, speculation, and stitches. Strangers wrote essays about them. An influencer recreated the will reading as a skit, and it got 2.5 million likes in a day. But the worst wasn't the strangers, it was the neighbors, the ones who used to wave politely. Now they whispered. At the grocery store, someone called my son a parasite, loud enough for others to hear. My daughter's yoga studio quietly canceled her membership. My grandson lost a brand deal after a Reddit thread blew up, because no one hates like the internet with a moral compass. They tried to fight back. My daughter gave a statement to the local news. My mother was confused at the end. We loved her very much. The clip went viral, not because of what she said, but because of how her voice cracked when she couldn't finish a sentence about my generosity. Someone stitched it with an old voicemail, me asking if she'd bring soup that week. Her response, "Can't, busy again." The contrast was brutal. The internet isn't kind to revisionists. My son tried a podcast interview. He said I'd been manipulated by outside forces. But when asked who exactly had manipulated me, he froze, blinked 3 times. Then the host played a clip from one of my recorded letters. My voice, calm, firm, undeniable. "You had 20 years to visit. You chose convenience. I chose clarity." The episode was titled, "Ghosted by Grandma, When the Will Speaks Louder Than Blood." By the end of the week, the local church took my photo off the family wall of service. Too much controversy. My grandson deleted all photos of me from his Instagram. Someone noticed, screenshotted it, called it erasing the evidence. The comments got ugly, but none of that hurt me, because I wasn't watching from the shadows, wringing my hands. I was gone. And honestly, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something quieter, peace. Because for once, I didn't have to defend myself. I didn't have to explain why I cried in my kitchen or why I stopped answering calls that only came when tuition was due or rent was late. The world saw me, finally. Not as a burden, not as a sad afterthought, but as a woman who made a choice. Janice, sweet Janice, printed the article and framed it. "You're famous now," she said to the air when she placed it beside the flowers on my porch. "They say legacy is what people remember about you when you're gone. But sometimes, legacy is what they can't forget about themselves." I didn't leave behind a house. I left behind a reckoning. And the best part? I never had to raise my voice. It's the light or the burial. When you spend your life waiting for someone to see you, the real you, and they never do, you have 2 choices. You can disappear quietly, or you can leave in a way they'll never forget. I chose the second. Not out of spite, but out of something deeper, clarity. Because in the end, I didn't want to be remembered as someone they missed. I wanted to be understood as someone they never truly knew. And maybe, just maybe, make sure no other old woman sits in a silent room wondering if she ever mattered. The truth is, I did love them. I still do in some faded way. But love without respect is just a performance. And I got tired of acting. That's why I planned every word, every dollar, every pause, not to punish them, but to release myself from their grip. I wasn't angry when I wrote that will. I was finally free. I spent my last days doing small things with unusual care. I folded laundry slowly. I baked one final pie, not for anyone, just to smell the cinnamon rise. I opened every window in the house and let the air in, as if I were giving the walls one last breath. I even wrote one final letter, not to them, to myself. I left it in my nightstand drawer. It said, "You did not fail. You simply outgrew who they let you be." There is a strange lightness in leaving with your story intact, in knowing that even if they never said thank you, the world will understand what you endured. And someone out there, maybe a woman watching this with her own tired eyes, will feel seen. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, strong, that's what this was always about. Not revenge, not even justice, but resonance. Letting the silence speak. Letting the forgotten woman become unforgettable. And if you're listening, yes, you, the one who's thinking of your own grandmother or mother, or maybe even yourself, hear this. Your worth is not a reward. It is not something people give you when you behave. It's inherent, it's fire. And it never goes out, no matter how many people try to ignore its heat. So speak, act, document, name the silence. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones we shout. They're the ones we whisper until the world can't stop hearing them. I didn't leave behind a dynasty. I left behind a decision to matter. And maybe one day, when the wind moves through the curtains of my old house, and the light hits just right, someone will sit on that porch, open that book, read those words, and know she was here. And she chose to be seen. And if this story stirred something in you, maybe it reminded you of someone, maybe it revealed something about yourself. Either way, don't let it fade. This is Grandma's Real Stories, where forgotten voices speak the loudest. Real stories, raw truth, and the reckoning we all carry in silence or in legacy. If you felt this, share it. Tell us in the comments, what would your grandmother have said if she could speak without fear? And remember, the quietest people often leave the loudest echoes. See you in the next story.